to talk with you and have a conversation. Not so much a lecture, although I do have some ideas and some facts to share with you. I have to confess that when Susan called me to ask for the title of this talk, and if anybody wants to move closer, I promise I won't bite. I don't know if it's the title or what, but I was in middle grading, and so the notion of courage was right there in my face. I don't know whether we'll discuss too much courage, but there are some reasons why this might be appropriate. Luckily, we know that the ideas, the issues, the concerns about food and where it comes from and how it's produced and what it's doing to us and our diets have now reached very much the public eye. And people are hearing on television and reading in newspapers and magazines about a whole variety of issues related to food. And I think it's important when we think about healthy neighborhoods to put that conversation in the context of food. And I know certainly CDC, of its 10 winnable battles, or the top priorities, 2 of them are directly related to food: obesity and let's see, what's the second one? There's 10 of those things, and one of them is obesity, and the other related to food is I don't know, I've forgotten. But food is interconnected to all of these things. And one might say that the origins of this conversation were bringing the ideas to public attention, were the writings, and particularly the book that Eric Schlosser published in 2001, Fast Food Nation. If you haven't read it, I would urge you to do so. It's got a lot of very important facts and connections. He was really the first to try to start connecting the dots between what we're doing on the farm and what we're experiencing in our health in our country. So the connecting of the dots is what I've been trying to do for the last 20 years. And as I say, we're seeing all kinds of publicity now about a whole variety of things related to farming. But this conversation really started in the 70s. And these are a few of the folks that I admire for their work. You may not know who they are. You may not recognize them. This guy is Jim Hightower, who was involved with the USDA back in the 70s. Eventually served on the Agriculture Committee in his state. He's a populist. He has a radio show. He's a crazy man. I'd love to meet him. But he's the kind of guy who would have been the little kid in the crowd when the king walked down the street with no clothes. And he's been pointing this out for quite some time. Wendell Berry, I hope most of you have at least heard that name. A wonderful philosopher, poet, writer, who has, again, been writing since the 70s about what has happened to agriculture. And to me, one of the most important thinkers in this area, Frances Moore Lapay. I hope some of you have read her Diet for a Small Planet, originally published in 1971. And in that book, she identified 8 dangerous trends. And I'm sure we're all familiar with them. She argued that our diet had evolved since 1900 to include too much protein from meat rather than plants. It had too much fat. It had too much sugar. Too much salt. None of this is a surprise, right? Not enough fiber. directly related to the fact that we weren't eating enough fruits and vegetables, getting more of our protein from meat, too much alcohol, and dangerous chemical food additives. So these were 8 areas that she identified as trends that we should be worried about. She described a little bit in this book about what the sources of these bad food items were, how food was evolving. This is 1971. Well, oops, I'll just go back here. I don't know how many of you have read this New York Times article that was published by Michael Pollan, where he basically laid out the argument that partly because of an effort to deal with the effects of these trends, the Senate Special Committee on the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition was formed, and an effort was made to study these trends and make recommendations to the American public. And the first recommendation, which didn't get published, was eat less meat. And that recommendation, which got completely shot down by the American cattlemen and other people who are interested in having us eat more meat, launched an idea of what Pollan calls nutritionism. If you haven't read this, it's kind of an interesting look at what we're doing with nutrition these days, because we're focusing on nutrients rather than food. And so we can discuss all kinds of things that have no political implications at all. You can worry about eating less fat, but that doesn't say eat less meat. So it's a big difference. So where have we come with these trends since 1970? I had to use 1970 because that's the data I got, but close enough. In 2006, meat consumption got up 11% from the time that Lapay identified this as an issue. Fat consumption, almost 60%. Sugar, 17%. Salt, this actually is a decrease from what Lapay identified in the 70s, so that's a good thing. Still not enough fiber, unfortunately. We have reduced our alcohol consumption a little bit, another good thing. But hundreds of more dangerous additives from chemicals. And that could be a whole topic for discussion. I don't know, have any of you seen the little video done by the Environmental Working Group called 10 Americans? Have you seen that? Environmental Working Group has been out there for years doing things like posting all of the names of the farms by state and how much subsidy they receive. So you can go and find out, how much farm subsidy farms in your state have been receiving. They've also done this very interesting little study called 10 Americans. I won't give it away because it's kind of got a little twist to it, but take a look at it. It was developed to try to encourage updating of the Chemical Safety Act, which I'll get to at the end here. But we figured out in the 60s, 50s, and 60s how to create chemicals that synthesize chemicals that do not exist. So we figured out how to do that, and we created hundreds of thousands of them, 81,000 chemicals that are now part of the conversation about what to do about chemicals. And many of them we're getting exposed to. So we know the outcome. We've all seen these kinds of statistics. And we can have a similar chart for diabetes, a similar chart for cancer. Most of the chronic diseases that we have identified since the end of World War II are in this kind of a spike. Well, I guess we should go that way. So we don't need to belabor that. What we don't really appreciate so much is the connection between all of that activity and the dramatic change that has happened in food production in this country. What we used to call farming, we now call agriculture, and they're two different things. So, you know, we have under 2 million farmers in the U.S. and about 921 million acres of farmland. And those 2 million farmers control what is planted on that farmland. People at the USDA are very proud to tell us that our farms are so efficient that fewer than 2 million farmers can feed the 310 million of us, or however many, not going up. What they don't acknowledge is that 20% of our fruits and 30% of our vegetables are imported. And that's because over half the cropland in this country is growing 2 crops, corn and soybeans. So this data tells a story that travels all the way through the food production system, all the way through distribution, acquisition, to our neighborhoods. What do we do with all this corn? 93 million acres of corn planted last year. Well, most of it we use to feed livestock, so we can eat more meat. And if you listen to people like the folks at Monsanto, they will say to you, the world is demanding more meat. We have to figure out how we're going to grow more corn so that we can produce more meat. We also use a fair amount of it to produce ethanol, which is probably the most insane environmental thing ever to do because it takes more energy to grow corn than we get out of it. But these folks will tell us how much money we've saved on imported oil. And then you've got all this stuff down here with the high fructose corn syrup and all the long, long lists. I presume many of you have read Omnivore's Dilemma, and you've seen the long lists of stuff that are derived from corn that go into food. In fact, all of the processed food that we eat has corn, and most of it has soybean as well. So we're eating what we're growing. I think that it's, in terms of courage, I forgot to go back to the McGovern effort to tell people to eat less meat, which he obviously didn't have the courage to do. It's high time that we tell our legislators, our restaurants where we eat, our other interactions we have in grocery stores or wherever, that we want good food. We don't want this. And so that would be one challenge that I would put out there for you. Who would we need to talk to? Well, besides legislators, there's powerful lobbies, Farm Bureau being number one. Powerful farm lobbies that support us, that this is a whole world of their understanding of what we should be doing. And then, of course, there are the industry leaders who are providing the food for us in the stores, the PepsiCos, the Walmarts, the American Grocers Association, Cargill, Tyson. I mean, there are really only a handful of companies at this point that are supplying most of what we get in the grocery store. In fact, an interesting sociologist at Cornell did a little study where he identified 136 individual people who serve on the boards of the companies that provide half the food to us in our grocery store. So that's kind of interesting, huh? bad, but they all have the same mindset. That's what's a little scary about it. So while places like the prevention research centers across the country spend millions, thousands on research to help prevent bad decisions relative to food, giant manufacturers and processors spend millions on research to manipulate fat, sugar, and salt into ever more resistible snacks, prepared foods, and soft drinks. And they spend billions on advertising and marketing to persuade us that food and drinks with almost no nutritional value are refreshing, delicious, and healthful. Just as an example, last year PepsiCo spent $1.7 billion on advertising their soft drinks, their drink products. That's what we're up against, people. So obesity and type 2 diabetes are not just problems of inner city neighborhoods. They're problems of the country, and they're problems of the world. I just came back this fall from a trip to India, in which I was shocked as I drove through Delhi to see the number of diabetes centers. And I asked our tour guide, or our guide, I said, what's this about? He said, oh yes, we have a very, very serious problem with diabetes in India. Just to illustrate what the USDA is trying to do, you've all seen the food pyramid. You all know these educational efforts. They're probably posted in every school cafeteria in the country. And now this is the simple version. Doesn't really address any of these issues. I don't even know, I mean, I assign my students, I say, go take this and use it for a couple of days to figure out what to eat. When this is the reality. Calories from sugar, calories from fat, and calories, period. So, I get a little angry when I think about the fact that my tax dollars are going to subsidize farms that are growing corn and soybeans so that people can drink this in a very inexpensive package, right? You take sugar. This should have been a little bit earlier, but you can read this yourself in terms of the World Health Organization identifying diet and its resulting overweight and obesity issues in terms of risks across the world. Accompanying the changes to industrial agriculture are a couple of things that most of us, I think, don't think about. Many of you have heard the notion of monoculture. You know, that now we're raising vast fields, I guess you could call it, of one crop, whether it's one or two kinds of corn, one or two kinds of soybeans, one or two kinds of raspberries. Doesn't matter. I mean, in your pictures, I can show you raspberry growing in Oregon, just enormous. And monoculture is a problem for a couple of reasons. One is, if you don't grow a variety of plant or animal, pretty soon its seeds and its availability are gone. So we're not actually killing things, you know, but biodiversity is being vastly diminished in the food world by a monoculture approach. The other interesting to think about as this technology moves across the world, which it is at a very rapid rate, we're losing more local diets and the ability to produce them. So foods that have been traditionally supportive of people in Indonesia, for example, where now evidently there is an enormous deficit of vitamin A, and we have scientists out there trying to create golden rice so we can insert beta-carotene into rice because children are being born blind without enough vitamin A in their diets. What's really happened is we've destroyed the diets that people enjoyed for centuries. So when I started the farmers market, and friends of mine and I who did that, I had no clue about any of this. I was just a mom who wanted to have good food for my kids, and I had been accustomed to going to a farmer's market in another town, which I guess I can't mention, but it's Ann Arbor. And when I moved here, I thought, well, where's the farmer's market? You know, it's just what we do. I didn't know about any of this then. But one of the things that it's helped me say now is that sometimes small things can make huge differences. And this is part of my positive, getting around to the good stuff now. And I want to mention that to you because I think it's important not to lose hope in spite of the fact that Pepsi has a $1.7 billion marketing budget. There are things we can and are doing at a grassroots level that are changing the health and the diets of people across the country. When we started planning in 1994, there were about 1,000 farmers markets around the country that the USDA had identified in their database. Last summer, there were 10,000. Now, there are only 5,000 hospitals in this country. So think about it, 10,000, and how many more we could have. Makes a huge difference. I'm not suggesting that everyone should run out and try to start another farmer's market. Certainly there's more demand now than we can supply. That's kind of a good problem. But I am suggesting first and foremost that we all take a look at becoming the change we hope to see. So that we're very fortunate to have Bon Appetit on this campus. I don't know who made that decision, but I thank them every time I eat here because they get it. They can't always get it because there isn't a supply, but they understand what it's about. And we're very fortunate. I haven't had mine at lunch yet, but it sure smells good, and I hope it was good. And I noticed they didn't serve any soft drinks. Did you notice that? I had invited Jim O'Brien, and I was going to say that if he were here, I'd like to have them have the courage to refuse to serve soft drinks. Not a bit of courage, but he did already. Seriously, though, we really need to set an example. And in all the work we do and all the conversations we have, we need to be sure that we know where our lunches come from, and that we're cooking, and that we're experiencing good food. In terms of research, I think there are many things that are unknown that could make a difference in moving this conversation forward. For example, you're all familiar with this. Congress is fighting over whether we should reduce SNAP benefits between 4 million and 40 million, or maybe it's billion, who knows, when they really ought to be saying, here's a chance to help people eat better food. Why not do an experiment here in Cleveland and see if people could be offered twice the benefits with restricted purchases. You can only buy fruits and vegetables, meats, raw foods, you know. You can get twice as much money, but you can't buy soft drinks. What a notion. We do this with WIC. We've been doing it for years to help moms eat better, right? Farmers market coupons have, for some farmers, become 30% of their revenue. People use them. So let's get creative. When we realize what we're up against, let's see if we can't make a difference. And I think it would be a fabulous research project. What do I know? But it might be of interest. What about cooking? A lot of people argue, oh, well, good food's too expensive. It's kind of like, huh? Good food's too expensive? Are you kidding me? It's worth the cost, first of all. But secondly, I would argue that a nutritious, simple, home-cooked meal is always going to beat out fast food or processed food if it's analyzed on a nutrition per dollar basis. I think it'd be very interesting to see a research project that took on that challenge. So can we use the same dollars and help people learn how to do simple food at home that's nutritious and change their lives? So there are many things that we could explore. Part of the issue here may be people don't know how to cook. They don't have anything to cook with. One of the board members of IFO has started a little nonprofit where she recycles cooking utensils and has outfitted 6 or 7 kitchens for people because they basically had nothing to cook with. Sometimes these very small, simple changes can make a big difference. And I'll finish by just talking a couple of minutes about, at the other end of the spectrum, outside of the small things we can do in our own hearts, in our own neighborhoods, and in the neighborhoods we work in. What about at the federal level? Does anyone know what the Food Conservation and Energy Bill of 2012 is? It's the Farm Bill. Farm Bill that we've been trying to pass and debating over. Interesting it has that name, right? And we're still fighting about it. And we may end up with another 2-year extension of what we've got now, which means millions of subsidies, millions of dollars of subsidies for corn and soy, wheat, and cotton, and a couple of other commodities. And who knows what will actually happen to SNAP, because that's the largest portion of the Farm Bill is funding for nutrition programs. I mentioned the Toxic Substances Act. It was passed in '76. Again, we could have a whole talk about that. Hasn't been updated. Meanwhile, thousands of new chemicals have come into the marketplace. They do not have to be proven safe. And I would argue that with GMOs and toxic chemicals and all these things are there's two problems. One is patenting, and 2 is we don't really know how to test these products for safety. We just don't. In the case of toxic chemicals, we don't have to, but in the case of GMOs and others, we're not. We don't do it. And then the other thing that's affecting on the farm side and on the production side more than on the consumer side is the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is also being considered in Congress right now. And as many of these large bills that relate to food, even at the state level do, is they try to regulate those industrial processes, those confined animal feeding operations, those slaughterhouses that kill 400 cattle a minute or some crazy thing, And by putting the various structures in place to control those environments, they make it more and more difficult for the real farmer, the small farmer, the one who's trying to produce good food for us, to even operate. So this has a lot of danger from my perspective, because I know where I get my food. And I'm frankly less sanguine about trying to have much impact on any of these things because of the power of the dollar that comes from agribusiness. It obviously is huge. That doesn't mean we should acquiesce, however. Sherrod Brown is on the Agriculture Committee. Marcia in the Senate. Marcia Fudge is on the Agriculture Committee in the House. Marcy Kaptur, I hope some of you have heard of her. Has been fighting for sustainable farming for a long time, and now her district is even part of Cuyahoga County, I believe. So we have people in Washington who can make a difference. But they need to hear from us, and they need to know that we care about these issues and that we understand the links between what goes on the farm and what goes on in the neighborhoods. So I want to stop there, because I'm getting up on a high horse here, and answer any questions or engage you in some conversation. I've tried to do a little bit of looking at what the center does, and I think there's some very interesting work, applaudable work that you're doing to try to improve health in neighborhoods, particularly related to food, which is the thing I know something about. And so I encourage that, hope it continues, but I'd like to see if you have any questions or challenges. Maybe you disagree with what I've said.
So I have a question.
Go ahead.
Those 136 people, how many of them went to Harvard Business School? With you?
There are a few who went to Harvard Business School with me, but are not on that list. Some that
I think that's, one of the problems I think is that you mentioned someone starts a nonprofit. Nonprofits don't draw people who go to business school and who are really good at, because those people are interested in making money.
Well, let me,
I've
got a lot of things to say about this. First of all, you're right.
I think you have to have a sustainable profit model to sell the value of the good food to the people, and they'll get healthier. And the real link, I'm a physician.
Yeah.
The real link is that we have a healthcare crisis.
Absolutely.
And if people eat better, they will utilize the healthcare system less. But I'm very pessimistic about convincing the Senate. But you said there's growing awareness. It's easier to sell it to individuals who want to remain healthy. They have their friends experiencing ill health. The baby boom is sort of freaking out.
Well, and as I said, it's not just this country. We are exporting this Western diet and these health issues that go with them all over the world. So it's not just the U.S. Michael Pollan was here two falls ago, and somebody asked him at the end of his talk, Michael Pollan wrote on the horse, I'm sure you've all heard of him. How is this going to change? What's going to happen? And his response I thought was very interesting. He said, I think that this change is going to come from the health insurance industry. Because businesses can't afford the kind of health care premiums they're paying for people who have these issues. Now, what influence can they have other than to cut people off is a question. But I agree with you.
So I don't think it's from the health industry because it doesn't want to contract.
No,
it's
insurance.
Even the
insurance.
So.
And the corporations that are paying the insurance.
The money. Who's it costing? Whose bottom line can be improved? So the corporate they're competing and they want to be competitive so that they have healthier employees who, and when we say healthier, the brain is included.
Absolutely.
As a psychiatrist, so, they'll think better, they'll be in a better mood.
Sure.
I was very struck when I decided to get a cat. And it was the first time. So I went online and what kind of food is best? And a veterinary technician that I became acquainted with said, well, we can tell the animals that come into us that are fed the higher quality foods don't get sick as much, and the other ones, this is old science. My mother was a food and nutrition major, graduated from Mather College in 1941. This is old science. This is not new science.
Right.
And so...
It is new ingredients, however, because your cat is eating corn and soybeans as well, if you're feeding them the cheap stuff.
Right, you didn't mean my cats. My cats have an 80%.
I'm sure you're cooking for them every night.
And it flosses.
My cats get, fish and chicken and meat produce. I thought about letting them, creating a section in my house or on my deck so they could actually, letting mice off, go, and they could just go and even follow their instincts.
Don't you have enough chipmunks for them to...
But I think that's
So
the
another
connection.
question.
Yeah.
No question, and I just wanted to say about the Harvard Business School thing, I vowed that I would not go back to Harvard Business School until I could tell them this story in a way that would make sense to them. And it's interesting that there are a number of people who are heads of nonprofits. Maybe they couldn't get a job in industry, I don't know, like me, who are leading organizations that are trying to make a difference. But I absolutely agree with your point about needing to understand the economics, the business side. Go look at the annual report of PepsiCo. It will blow your mind.
Thank you, Mary, for a great talk. One of the things that I've always had a hard time with somebody like Michael Pollan,
Yep.
I think he's done a great job to raise consciousness, but he comes back to a solution that's very individually oriented. He's, coins, vote with your fork. One person at a time, we're going to change this problem. I mean, this problem that multiple billions of dollars are being spent to tell us to do one thing, and that we're going to somehow create the army of force. And I just think about my own self. I mean, I'm in the level of knowledge on this, the 1%, probably even less than 1%.
Yeah.
And yet, the other day I cooked with my son in an apron that he got for his birthday last year when he turned 3 years old. And that might have been the first time that, not to say we haven't cooked since he turned 3, but we really rarely get a chance to cook. And this is something that I value. I think it's important. When I come home, it is like a race to go from one thing to the next. I've been working all day, and I only work one job. And I have a partner, and I have an income, and blah, 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 all these great resources that help me, and a lot of knowledge and skills, and I actually even like to cook. So the concern I always have with these is that what do we do to go up? Because while it's really scary to say Senate's not going to do anything, or the House, or whatever, if we can't go up, I mean, even I liked your conversation about the budgets of all the PRCs in the country are like a drop in the pond of this other funding. So what do we do? How do we mobilize beyond one fork at a time to create change, I guess? What's the systems level change?
Well, I do think that the modifications to the Farm Bill, and there's more and more and more energy around eliminating those subsidies. I mean, the powers of the agribusiness world are still great, but that, I think there are enough people now taking a look at that to say, at some point, this has got to go. Taxpayers can't afford it, the budget can't afford it, you know, so that may be a small drop too, even at that level. What I wonder is, how do we get farmers who are the stewards of that 920 million acres or whatever it is, to stop growing this food that is an input to a whole industrial food system. And the only way they can do that is if they can make money doing something else, growing something else. And how can they grow something else unless we demand it? Unfortunately, it comes down to that fork. And I know people have criticized Colin and said, how can we ever do this? But we got here without really realizing it. There are a lot of people who have no idea about this at all. So as we expose it, and I agree with you, trying to find time every night to cook and all that, I mean, that's a huge challenge for lots of people. On the other hand, you look at the number of hours that people spend watching food shows. I know you don't, but, or other things. To some extent, it's a matter of priority. And I think physicians need to be more forthcoming with their patients. My own physician says, you know, people, they won't admit that they smoke or they don't smoke, but they'll tell me I don't, and I never eat a fruit or vegetable. And what do you say to them when they say that to you? You're killing yourself.
There was a story this summer about physicians in New York giving out prescriptions for...
I read about that.
Yeah.
Very cool.
For markets.
And maybe they need to be more creative. I know you had a question.
It's actually a comment, and it's another component of the big money Pepsi and blah, blah, blah. There was a really interesting article in the New York Times last February about the science of addiction for junk food. And what stands out to me is the Dorito, whether that was it or not, I'm not sure.
Right.
But just how much money and effort is spent into getting that sweet spot where you're not satiated, but your body's craving more,
You're still
and there's
craving.
fat
That's right.
content, and it's really astonishing.
Have you all seen or read End of Overeating?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of anecdotal. And this is Michael Kessler, who is the former, David Kessler, sorry, former director of the FDA, but he didn't quite fit the mold. Tried to get people to stop smoking, I think, was his bad thing. Yeah. So he's written a book called The End of Overeating, in which he uses interviews with food science people and restaurants and so forth around the world to basically expose the fact that these folks are spending millions and millions of dollars on research to get that sweet spot. And I mean, I don't know how the head of Pepsi sleeps at night, or Coca-Cola, or you know, a lot of other things. But
And they are using a one-fork strategy. They're finding the individual sweet spot to get that person coming back.
absolutely,
It's very insidious.
it's very insidious. So this whole thing is pretty insidious, and yet there are more and more people who are revealing to us what's going on.
I think the change really has to happen at the policy level, like you're talking about with the Farm Bill.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's just as simple as ending the subsidy, though,
Mm-hmm.
because these farmers have been forced to rely on this large-scale farming with expensive equipment and things, and this is the system that we've set up so corporations can